The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his tactical vest one final time. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like the heavy gear strapped to his back. His team of 8 Navy SEALs had been tasked with what military briefings coldly labeled a high-value target elimination mission. But Jake knew the reality was far more complex than any PowerPoint presentation could convey. Team Bravo had been operating in the Hindu Kush Mountains for 6 weeks, gathering intelligence on a Taliban commander known only as the Wolf. This elusive figure had been responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition forces across 3 provinces, and intelligence suggested he was planning something big. The mission parameters seemed straightforward: locate, observe, and eliminate the target with minimal collateral damage. Jake's team consisted of 7 other highly trained operators, each bringing unique skills to the table. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Chen was their communications specialist, a quiet man from California who could work miracles with radio equipment even in the most challenging conditions. Petty Officer First Class Danny Rodriguez served as their medic, carrying enough medical supplies to treat everything from minor cuts to life-threatening wounds. The team's sniper, Petty Officer Second Class Alex Thompson, had earned a reputation for making impossible shots under pressure. The remaining team members included demolitions expert Tommy Walsh, whose Irish accent still carried traces of his Boston upbringing, and 3 assault specialists, Kevin Park, Brian Foster, and the youngest member of the group, 24-year-old Sam Mitchell. Each man had volunteered for this deployment, knowing the risks that came with operating in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Their target was reportedly hiding in a compound approximately 15 miles northeast of their current position. The area was known for its maze-like valleys and towering peaks that could hide entire armies. Local intelligence, gathered through a network of Afghan informants, suggested the Wolf would be meeting with other Taliban leaders at the compound within the next 48 hours. As the team prepared to move out from their temporary base camp, Jake reviewed the mission details one more time with his men. The plan called for them to establish an observation post overlooking the target compound, confirm the presence of the Wolf, and then call in either a drone strike or coordinate their own direct action assault. Extraction would occur at a predetermined landing zone approximately 2 miles south of the target area. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the next 3 days, which would provide excellent visibility, but also make the team more vulnerable to detection. Jake had requested additional air support, but command had denied the request, citing the need to maintain operational security and avoid alerting enemy forces to their presence. Marcus Chen performed final checks on their communications equipment, ensuring they could maintain contact with their forward operating base throughout the mission. The team would be operating beyond the range of most conventional radio systems, relying on satellite communications and a series of relay stations positioned throughout the region. As they began their trek through the mountainous terrain, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something about this mission felt different. His instincts, honed through dozens of similar operations, were telling him to be extra cautious. The intelligence seemed too clean, too convenient. In his experience, operations that appeared straightforward on paper often became complicated once they made contact with the enemy. The team moved in a standard formation, with Alex Thompson taking point to scout the route ahead. His sniper training made him particularly skilled at reading terrain and identifying potential threats. Behind him, Jake maintained overall command and control while staying in constant communication with the rear guard, ensuring no one fell behind or became separated from the group. The first few hours of movement proceeded without incident. They covered approximately 8 miles, crossing 2 valleys and ascending a significant ridge that would eventually lead them toward their target area. The physical demands of carrying full combat loads through such challenging terrain tested even their exceptional conditioning. But each man had trained extensively for exactly these conditions. During a scheduled rest break, Danny Rodriguez treated minor injuries that had already begun to accumulate among the team members. The rocky terrain was taking its toll on their feet and ankles, while the thin mountain air made every breath a conscious effort. Despite these challenges, morale remained high as they continued to make good progress toward their objective. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jake made the decision to establish their overnight position in a small cave system they had identified during their pre-mission planning. The caves would provide concealment from both aerial observation and thermal imaging systems that enemy forces might be using to patrol the area. Tommy Walsh set up a perimeter security system using motion sensors and night vision cameras that would alert the team to any approaching threats. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen established communications with their base, providing an update on their progress and confirming that they remained on schedule to reach the target area by the following evening. The team settled in for what they hoped would be a quiet night, with guards rotating every 2 hours to maintain security while allowing the others to rest. Jake found himself staring up at the star-filled sky, thinking about his wife Sarah and their 2 young children back home in Virginia Beach. These quiet moments before major operations always brought his family to mind, reminding him of what he was fighting to protect. Unknown to Jake and his team, their presence in the region had not gone unnoticed. Taliban scouts had been tracking coalition movements in the area for weeks, and the Wolf had already received word that American Special Operations Forces were likely heading toward his location. What the SEALs believed to be a routine hunting expedition was about to become a deadly game of cat and mouse, with their own survival hanging in the balance. As the team prepared for sleep, none of them could have imagined that within 24 hours, they would be fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, abandoned by the very command structure that had sent them into harm's way, and dependent on nothing but their training, their weapons, and each other to survive the nightmare that was about to unfold in the mountains of Afghanistan. Dawn broke with an eerie silence that immediately put Jake Morrison on edge. After 15 years of military service, he had learned to trust his instincts, and something about the morning felt wrong. The usual sounds of mountain wildlife were absent, replaced by an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums. He moved carefully from his sleeping position and began waking his team members, using hand signals to maintain operational security. Alex Thompson was already awake, his sniper's senses having detected the same unsettling atmosphere. He had spent the last hour glassing the surrounding terrain through his scope, searching for any signs of enemy movement. Everything appeared normal, but both he and Jake shared the same uneasy feeling that they were being watched. The team conducted their morning routine with practiced efficiency, breaking down their temporary camp and preparing for the final approach to their target area. Marcus Chen attempted to establish communications with their forward operating base, but encountered unexpected interference on all frequencies. The satellite link that had worked perfectly the night before now produced only static and broken transmissions. Danny Rodriguez conducted a quick medical check on each team member, ensuring everyone was ready for what could become an extended period of combat operations. The high altitude and physical demands of their movement had taken a toll. But all 8 men remained mission-capable and ready to continue. As they prepared to move out, Tommy Walsh noticed tracks in the soft soil near their cave entrance. The footprints appeared fresh, made sometime during the early morning hours while the team was sleeping. A careful examination revealed at least 3 different individuals had approached their position, observed them from a distance, and then withdrawn without making contact. Jake made the difficult decision to continue with the mission, despite this evidence of enemy surveillance. Turning back now would mean weeks of preparation had been wasted, and intelligence suggested their target might relocate within the next few days. However, he modified their approach route, choosing a more circuitous path that would take them through terrain that offered better concealment. The team moved with heightened awareness, every man scanning his assigned sector for signs of an ambush. Their progress slowed considerably as they took extra precautions, checking each ridgeline and valley before committing to cross open ground. The weight of their equipment seemed to increase with each mile, but none of the SEALs complained as they pushed forward through increasingly challenging terrain. By midday, they had covered less than half the distance Jake had hoped to achieve. The combination of difficult ground and enhanced security procedures was eating into their timeline, but he refused to compromise safety for speed. His experience had taught him that rushing into potentially dangerous situations was the quickest way to get good men killed. During a rest break in a small grove of stunted trees, Kevin Park spotted movement on a distant ridge. Through binoculars, the team observed a group of armed men moving parallel to their own route. The figures were too far away to identify positively, but their military-style movement and equipment suggested they were not local shepherds or farmers. Marcus Chen attempted once again to establish communications with their base, but the interference had grown stronger. Brief fragments of conversation could be heard through the static, but nothing clear enough to convey their situation or request guidance. The team was effectively cut off from outside support, operating alone in hostile territory with limited options for extraction. As afternoon wore on, the evidence of enemy presence continued to accumulate. Fresh vehicle tracks crossed their path at one point, indicating that Taliban forces were actively patrolling the area with trucks or motorcycles. Small cairns of stacked stones appeared at strategic locations, likely serving as markers for a communication system between enemy units. Jake called a meeting with his team leaders to reassess their situation. The original mission plan had assumed they would be operating in a relatively permissive environment, with minimal enemy presence. Instead, they found themselves in what appeared to be a heavily patrolled and possibly controlled area. The smart tactical decision would be to abort the mission and attempt to reach their extraction point. However, intelligence reports had stressed the importance of eliminating the wolf before he could execute whatever operation he was planning. The potential consequences of allowing him to escape could include dozens of coalition casualties in future attacks. Jake found himself weighing the immediate safety of his 8-man team against the broader strategic implications of mission failure. After consulting with his senior team members, Jake made the decision to continue toward their target. However, he implemented additional security measures and developed contingency plans for multiple scenarios. If they encountered significant enemy resistance, they would immediately break contact and attempt to reach an alternate extraction point approximately 12 miles to the west. As evening approached, the team found themselves within 3 miles of their intended observation post. The terrain had become increasingly rugged, with steep-sided valleys and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent concealment, but also limited their options for movement. Every shadow could hide an enemy position, and every sound carried the potential for discovery. Brian Foster, who had been serving as rear guard, reported that he had detected signs of being followed throughout the afternoon. Small disturbances in the natural environment suggested that one or more individuals were tracking their movement, staying far enough back to avoid detection while maintaining visual contact with the team. The realization that they were being hunted rather than hunting sent a chill through the group. These were not random Taliban patrols stumbling across their path, but rather a coordinated effort to track and potentially eliminate the American Special Operations Team. The enemy appeared to know their general location and intended destination, suggesting either a security breach or much better intelligence capabilities than anticipated. As darkness fell, Jake positioned his team in a defensible position among a cluster of large boulders. The location offered good fields of fire and multiple routes for withdrawal if necessary, but it also meant they were still several miles from their target area. The mission timeline was slipping away, and with each passing hour, the likelihood of successfully completing their objectives decreased. Tommy Walsh set up an enhanced perimeter defense using all available sensors and early warning devices. Meanwhile, Alex Thompson established a sniper position with commanding views of the most likely approach routes. The team prepared for what could be a long night, knowing that enemy forces were likely positioning themselves for an attack at first light. The attack came at 0430 hours, just as Jake Morrison had feared it would. The enemy had chosen the darkest hour before dawn, when human alertness naturally reaches its lowest point. Despite their preparations and rotating guard schedule, the Taliban forces managed to get within 50 meters of the SEAL position before Tommy Walsh's motion sensors triggered their first warning. The initial volley of automatic weapons fire shattered the pre-dawn. Silence like thunder, muzzle flashes lighting up the mountainside in deadly strobe patterns. Jake rolled behind cover as bullets sparked off the rocks around him, fragments of stone stinging his face and hands. His team reacted with the precision that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises, each man immediately engaging targets while simultaneously seeking better defensive positions. Alex Thompson's sniper rifle spoke first in response, the distinctive crack of his precision weapon cutting through the chaos of battle. His night vision scope allowed him to identify individual enemy fighters, and his first shot dropped a Taliban machine gunner who had been setting up to rake their position with sustained fire. The remaining enemy fighters immediately shifted their focus toward the sniper's muzzle flash, forcing Alex to abandon his initial position and seek new cover. Marcus Chen fought to establish communications, while incoming rounds forced him to keep his head down. The radio interference that had plagued them throughout their movement had grown even stronger, reducing their satellite communications to useless static. They were completely cut off from outside support. Facing an unknown number of enemy fighters with no possibility of calling for reinforcement or evacuation, Danny Rodriguez moved between team members under fire, checking for casualties while distributing additional ammunition from his medical pack. The team had brought enough supplies for a 3-day observation mission, not an extended firefight against superior numbers. Every round had to count if they hoped to survive long enough to find a way out of their desperate situation. The enemy attack was far more sophisticated than typical Taliban operations in the region. Rather than the usual disorganized assault, these fighters demonstrated tactical coordination and discipline that suggested extensive training. They used covering fire and movement techniques to advance on the SEAL position, while other elements attempted to flank around both sides of the defensive perimeter. Kevin Park engaged targets to the east, while Brian Foster covered the western approach. Both men were experienced combat veterans, but even they were impressed by the skill level of their opponents. These were not the poorly trained village fighters that coalition forces often encountered, but rather professional soldiers who understood small unit tactics and fire and movement principles. Sam Mitchell, the youngest member of the team, found himself facing his first major combat engagement. Despite his training, the reality of being shot at by multiple enemies was vastly different from any simulation he had experienced. However, his teammates' calm professionalism under fire helped steady his nerves, and he quickly settled into the rhythm of identifying targets, engaging them with aimed fire, and then moving to a new position before return fire could locate him. As the firefight continued, it became clear that the enemy forces significantly outnumbered the 8-man SEAL team. Jake estimated they were facing at least 25 Taliban fighters, possibly more, positioned in a rough semicircle around their defensive position. The enemy had clearly planned this engagement carefully, using the terrain to their advantage while attempting to pin down the Americans and prevent their escape. Tommy Walsh's demolitions expertise proved invaluable as he used small charges to create additional cover and block potential approach routes. His improvised explosions also served to confuse the enemy about the actual size of the SEAL force, leading some Taliban fighters to believe they were facing a much larger American unit. The battle raged for nearly 2 hours as dawn slowly lightened the eastern sky. The improved visibility helped the SEALs identify and engage targets more effectively, but it also revealed the true scope of their predicament. Enemy fighters occupied commanding positions on 3 sides of their location, with more Taliban forces visible moving to completely encircle their position. Jake realized that remaining in their current defensive position would eventually result in the team being overrun and killed. Despite the risks involved, he made the decision to attempt a fighting withdrawal toward higher ground approximately 800 meters to the north. The route would require crossing open terrain under enemy fire, but staying in place meant certain death. The withdrawal began with Alex Thompson providing overwatch from his sniper position, while the rest of the team moved in pairs toward their new destination. The first 2 men made it safely to an intermediate position, but as Kevin Park and Brian Foster attempted to follow, concentrated enemy fire forced them to take cover behind a small rocky outcropping that offered minimal protection. Danny Rodriguez volunteered to create a diversion that would allow the pinned-down team members to continue their movement. Using smoke grenades and sustained automatic fire, he drew enemy attention toward his position while Park and Foster sprinted across the exposed ground. The tactic worked, but it also revealed Danny's location to multiple enemy fighters who immediately concentrated their fire on his position. Marcus Chen finally managed to establish brief contact with their forward operating base, but the transmission lasted only long enough to report their situation before the signal was lost again. The fragmentary message indicated they were under attack and taking casualties, but provided no specific location information that could be used to organize a rescue attempt. As the team continued their fighting withdrawal, it became apparent that enemy forces were not only pursuing them, but also attempting to drive them toward a predetermined location. The Taliban fighters seemed to know the terrain intimately, using hidden paths and concealed positions to maintain contact while herding the SEALs away from potential extraction points. The realization that they were being deliberately maneuvered rather than simply attacked sent a chill through Jake Morrison. This level of tactical sophistication suggested that the enemy had been planning this operation for some time, possibly with advanced knowledge of the SEAL team's mission and intended route. The Americans were not just fighting for their lives against superior numbers, but walking into what appeared to be an elaborately prepared trap. As enemy fire continued to pursue them up the mountainside, Jake began to understand that their original mission had been compromised from the beginning. Someone had provided detailed information about their plans to Taliban forces, turning what should have been a routine elimination mission into a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to destroy an entire SEAL team. The higher ground that Jake Morrison had hoped would provide better defensive positions turned out to be another carefully prepared killing field. As his team reached what appeared to be a defensible ridgeline, they discovered that Taliban forces had already positioned themselves in concealed fighting positions along the military crest. The SEALs found themselves caught in a crossfire between enemies below and above, with nowhere to go but further up the increasingly steep mountainside. Sam Mitchell took the first serious casualty as the team scrambled for cover among the loose rocks and sparse vegetation. A Taliban sniper's bullet caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down several feet of rocky slope. Danny Rodriguez immediately moved to provide medical aid, working under fire to stop the bleeding and stabilize the wound, while bullets continued to snap overhead. The injury was serious, but not life-threatening, assuming they could get Sam to proper medical facilities within a reasonable time frame. However, their current situation offered no possibility of medical evacuation, and carrying a wounded man would significantly slow their movement while making everyone more vulnerable to enemy fire. Jake faced the agonizing decision that every combat leader dreads, weighing the life of one team member against the survival of the entire unit. Alex Thompson had managed to identify the enemy sniper's position and was working to eliminate the threat. The Taliban marksman was using a Soviet-era Dragunov rifle from a well-concealed position, approximately 400 meters away. Alex's superior training and equipment gave him the advantage in the long-range duel, but the enemy sniper was clearly skilled and experienced, making each shot count while constantly changing positions to avoid counterfire. Marcus Chen's communications equipment had suffered damage during their movement up the mountainside, reducing their already limited ability to contact outside help. He worked frantically to repair the damaged components while enemy fire forced him to remain pressed against the rocky ground. Even if he could restore communications, the team was now far from any possible landing zones that helicopters could use for extraction. The Taliban forces demonstrated increasing coordination as the battle continued, using handheld radios to coordinate their movements and concentrate fire on the most vulnerable members of the SEAL team. Jake realized they were facing a well-trained enemy force with effective leadership and pre-planned positions throughout the area. This was not a chance encounter, but rather the execution of a carefully prepared ambush plan. Tommy Walsh attempted to use his demolitions to create barriers and block enemy approach routes, but his supply of explosive charges was rapidly dwindling. Each detonation had to serve multiple purposes, creating cover, disrupting enemy movements, and conserving their limited ammunition by forcing Taliban fighters to take longer routes around the obstacles he created. As the afternoon wore on, the team's ammunition situation became increasingly critical. They had started the mission carrying standard combat loads intended for a 3-day observation mission, not an extended firefight against superior numbers. Jake ordered his men to switch to semi-automatic fire and make every shot count, but even disciplined fire discipline could not stretch their remaining ammunition indefinitely. Kevin Park and Brian Foster had established an effective team fighting position that allowed them to cover each other while engaging targets. Their experience working together showed as they moved and fired in perfect coordination, one man engaging enemies while the other reloaded or shifted position. However, even their skill could not overcome the mathematics of their situation. 8 men facing an estimated 35 enemy fighters. The wounded Sam Mitchell insisted he could continue fighting despite his injury, but Danny Rodriguez was concerned about blood loss and the potential for infection if the wound was not properly treated soon. The young SEAL's determination was admirable, but his reduced mobility made him a liability that the team could ill afford in their current circumstances. Alex Thompson finally gained the upper hand in his sniper duel, placing a well-aimed shot that eliminated the Taliban marksman. The removal of the enemy sniper threat allowed the team to move more freely, but it also seemed to trigger a change in enemy tactics. Rather than continuing their direct assault, the Taliban fighters began to pull back to longer-range positions while maintaining pressure on the SEAL team. Jake initially interpreted this tactical shift as a positive development, but he soon realized that the enemy withdrawal was part of a larger plan. Taliban forces were establishing a loose cordon around their position while waiting for additional reinforcements to arrive. The Americans were being contained rather than destroyed, suggesting that the enemy had more resources available than previously estimated. As evening approached, Marcus Chen managed to restore partial communications capability to his damaged radio equipment. However, the fragmentary contact he established with their forward operating base brought devastating news. No rescue operations were being planned for their location. The official word was that their mission had been classified as failed with personnel status unknown, effectively writing off the entire team. The radio transmission lasted only 30 seconds before being lost again, but it was long enough for Jake to understand that they had been abandoned by their own command structure. Whether this decision was based on military necessity, political considerations, or simple bureaucratic incompetence was irrelevant. The 8-man SEAL team was on their own, facing overwhelming odds with no prospect of outside assistance. The psychological impact of learning they had been written off hit the team hard. These were professional warriors who had volunteered for dangerous missions with the understanding that everything possible would be done to bring them home safely. Discovering that they were considered expendable challenged fundamental assumptions about military loyalty and the bonds between soldiers and their leadership. Jake gathered his team leaders for a brief conference to discuss their options. They could attempt to break through the enemy cordon and try to reach friendly lines, but this would require moving through unknown terrain while being pursued by superior numbers. Alternatively, they could find a defensible position and hope to hold out long enough for the situation to change, though their limited ammunition and supplies made this option increasingly unlikely to succeed. Danny Rodriguez reported that Sam Mitchell's condition was stable but deteriorating. The young SEAL needed proper medical attention within the next 12 to 18 hours, or he risked serious complications from his wound. This medical timeline added another factor to Jake's already complex tactical calculations. As darkness fell over the Afghan mountains, the SEAL team prepared for what could be their final night. Enemy forces maintained their positions around the American location, occasionally firing random shots to prevent rest while conserving their own ammunition for the final assault that would likely come at dawn. The night brought no respite from their desperate situation. Taliban forces maintained their cordon around the SEAL position, using random gunfire and probe attacks to prevent the Americans from resting while conserving their own strength for what appeared to be a final assault planned for dawn. Jake Morrison found himself calculating and recalculating their remaining ammunition, knowing that mathematics would soon determine whether his team lived or died. Around midnight, Alex Thompson detected movement on the eastern ridge that suggested enemy reinforcements were arriving. Through his night vision scope, he counted at least 15 additional fighters taking positions along routes that would cut off any possible escape attempts. The Taliban forces now numbered approximately 50 fighters, more than 6 times the strength of the surrounded SEAL team. Sam Mitchell's condition had worsened throughout the night despite Danny Rodriguez's expert medical care. The young SEAL was running a fever that indicated infection was setting in, and his wounded shoulder had swollen significantly. He remained conscious and insisted he could continue fighting, but everyone knew he needed immediate evacuation to a proper medical facility to prevent life-threatening complications. Marcus Chen had managed to establish brief communications with an unknown station during the early morning hours, but the transmission quality was too poor to determine whether he was talking to friendly or enemy forces. The voice on the other end of the radio spoke English with what might have been an American accent, but static and interference made positive identification impossible. As dawn approached, Jake made the difficult decision to attempt a breakout toward the southwest. where intelligence maps suggested there might be a small village that could provide temporary shelter. The route would require crossing approximately 3 miles of open ground, while under observation and fire from enemy positions. But remaining in their current location guaranteed death or capture. The breakout began at first light with Tommy Walsh creating a diversion using his remaining demolition charges. The explosions drew enemy attention toward the eastern side of their perimeter, while the main body of SEALs moved toward their chosen escape route. Alex Thompson remained behind to provide covering fire, knowing that someone had to delay the enemy pursuit even if it meant sacrificing his own chance of escape. Kevin Park and Brian Foster took point during the withdrawal, using their combined experience to identify the safest route through the broken terrain. Behind them, Danny Rodriguez helped support the wounded Sam Mitchell while Jake coordinated the team's movement and maintained radio contact with Alex Thompson's overwatch position. The enemy response to their breakout attempt was swift and coordinated. Taliban forces immediately moved to intercept the escaping Americans while maintaining pressure on Alex Thompson's position to prevent him from providing effective covering fire. Machine gun teams established in pre-planned positions opened fire on the most likely escape routes, forcing the SEALs to take longer and more dangerous paths through the mountainous terrain. After moving approximately 800 meters from their original position, the team was forced to take cover when enemy fire became too intense to continue their withdrawal. They found themselves pinned down in a small depression that offered minimal protection from the surrounding high ground. Worse, they had lost radio contact with Alex Thompson, and his covering fire had ceased 20 minutes earlier. Marcus Chen attempted to re-establish communications with any friendly forces, while the rest of the team prepared defensive positions in their new location. His calls for assistance went unanswered except for occasional bursts of static that might have been responses or might have been atmospheric interference. The team was effectively alone, cut off from all outside support and facing annihilation. During a brief lull in enemy fire, Tommy Walsh volunteered to attempt reaching Alex Thompson's last known position to determine his status and possibly bring him back to the main group. Jake reluctantly approved the dangerous mission, knowing that leaving a team member behind violated every principle of SEAL operations, but also understanding that sending men to rescue Alex might result in additional casualties they could not afford. Tommy's movement toward the sniper position drew immediate enemy attention, confirming that Taliban forces were maintaining observation on all areas around their original defensive location. Heavy automatic weapons fire forced him to abandon the rescue attempt and return to the main group, where he reported seeing no signs of movement from Alex's position. The loss of their sniper was a devastating blow to team morale and combat effectiveness. Alex Thompson had been one of their most experienced operators, and his precision fire had been instrumental in keeping enemy forces at bay during the previous day's fighting. Without his overwatch capabilities, the remaining team members found themselves increasingly vulnerable to enemy marksmen. As the morning progressed, it became clear that Taliban forces were systematically tightening their encirclement while bringing up additional weapons and equipment. Jake observed enemy fighters carrying what appeared to be mortar tubes and rocket-propelled grenades, suggesting that the final assault would include heavy weapons that could easily overwhelm their improvised defensive position. Danny Rodriguez reported that Sam Mitchell was becoming delirious from fever and blood loss, requiring constant attention that reduced the team's overall fighting capability. The medic's supplies were nearly exhausted, and he was using torn clothing and improvised bandages to treat new wounds that team members sustained during their attempted breakout. Around midday, Marcus Chen achieved brief contact with what appeared to be an American military radio station. The transmission lasted only 15 seconds, but he was able to transmit their approximate location and urgent request for immediate extraction. However, the response was unclear, and he could not determine whether the information had been received or understood by whoever was monitoring that frequency. The psychological pressure of their situation was beginning to affect even the most experienced team members. Kevin Park, normally calm under pressure, began showing signs of combat stress as he realized they were likely facing their final hours. Brian Foster maintained his professional demeanor, but Jake could see the strain in his eyes as he calculated their rapidly diminishing ammunition supplies. Jake found himself thinking about the families of his team members, wondering how their deaths would be explained to wives and children who expected their loved ones to return home safely. The official reports would likely describe their mission as classified and their deaths as occurring during routine operations, providing no real comfort to the people who had lost husbands, fathers, and sons. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, enemy fire intensified in what appeared to be preparation for a final assault. Taliban forces had moved close enough that individual voices could be heard shouting coordination instructions in Pashto and Arabic. The end was approaching rapidly, and Jake Morrison began making final preparations for what military doctrine called fighting to the last round. The situation seemed hopeless when Marcus Chen suddenly detected a faint signal on an emergency frequency that had been silent throughout their ordeal. The transmission was weak and heavily distorted, but it appeared to be coming from somewhere high above their position, possibly from aircraft or a mountaintop relay station. For the first time in 36 hours, there was a glimmer of hope that someone might be coming to help. The weak radio signal that Marcus Chen had detected grew stronger as evening approached, eventually resolving into the voice of an American aircraft controller, identifying himself as Guardian Angel. The transmission quality was poor, but the words that came through the static were the most beautiful sound the surrounded SEALs had ever heard. "Bravo, team. This is Guardian Angel. We have your position. Prepare for immediate close air support." Jake Morrison could hardly believe what he was hearing. After being written off as lost by their own command structure, someone had apparently organized an unauthorized rescue mission. The aircraft controller explained that they were operating without official approval, but a combination of intercepts from Marcus's emergency transmissions and satellite imagery had allowed them to locate the surrounded team. The first indication that help had arrived came in the form of jet engines screaming overhead, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of precision-guided munitions impacting enemy positions on the surrounding ridges. Taliban fighters who had been confidently preparing for their final assault suddenly found themselves under attack from aircraft they had not detected approaching their location. Alex Thompson's voice suddenly crackled over the radio, weak but unmistakably alive. He had been pinned down in his sniper position for nearly 18 hours, wounded but still capable of providing target designation for the incoming airstrikes. His precision spotting allowed the aircraft to engage enemy positions with surgical accuracy, while avoiding the SEAL team's location. The air support included both fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, suggesting that multiple military units had contributed assets to the rescue operation, despite the lack of official authorization. Guardian Angel coordinated the attacks with professional efficiency, methodically destroying Taliban positions while creating a corridor that would allow helicopter extraction of the ground team. However, the rescue operation faced significant challenges. The mountainous terrain limited approach routes for extraction helicopters, while enemy forces continued to resist, despite the devastating air attacks. Taliban fighters were using caves and rocky overhangs to survive the bombing, then emerging to engage the aircraft with small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. During the airstrikes, Tommy Walsh was seriously wounded when shrapnel from a nearby explosion caught him in the leg and abdomen. Danny Rodriguez immediately began treating the new casualty, while continuing to monitor Sam Mitchell's deteriorating condition. The team now had 2 seriously wounded members, who would require immediate medical evacuation once extraction became possible. The helicopter assigned to extract the team made 3 unsuccessful attempts to reach their position, each time being driven off by intense ground fire from surviving Taliban positions. The aircraft sustained multiple hits during these attempts, with the crew chief reporting damage to critical systems that would prevent further rescue efforts until enemy resistance could be completely eliminated. Jake realized that his team would need to move to an alternate extraction point approximately 1 mile to the west, where the terrain offered better landing opportunities for helicopters. However, this movement would require crossing ground that was still partially controlled by enemy forces, and carrying 2 wounded men would make the entire team vulnerable to attack. Guardian Angel acknowledged the problem and began coordinating additional airstrikes to clear the route to the alternate landing zone. However, ammunition for the supporting aircraft was running low, and fuel constraints would soon force them to return to base for resupply. The rescue window was rapidly closing, requiring immediate action if the SEAL team was to survive. The movement to the extraction point began under cover of the final airstrikes, with Kevin Park and Brian Foster carrying Tommy Walsh, while Danny Rodriguez helped support Sam Mitchell. Jake coordinated with Guardian Angel to ensure that covering fire would be available during the most dangerous portions of their route across exposed ground. Enemy resistance along the route was lighter than expected, primarily because Taliban forces were focusing on survival rather than continued offensive operations. However, individual fighters and small groups continued to pose threats, requiring the SEALs to fight their way through several brief encounters while protecting their wounded teammates. Alex Thompson managed to reach the extraction point ahead of the main group. Despite his own injuries sustained during his extended isolation, his sniper position had become untenable when Taliban forces had nearly overrun it during the early stages of the airstrikes, forcing him to abandon most of his equipment while fighting his way clear. The extraction helicopter made its final approach under covering fire from the remaining aircraft, touching down just long enough for the team to load their wounded members and scramble aboard. Enemy fire continued throughout the pickup process, with several rounds striking the aircraft's armor plating as it lifted off and accelerated away from the landing zone. During the flight to the nearest medical facility, Danny Rodriguez worked frantically to stabilize both wounded men, using supplies provided by the helicopter's crew chief. Sam Mitchell had lost consciousness and was showing signs of shock, while Tommy Walsh was alert but losing significant amounts of blood from his abdominal wounds. Guardian Angel maintained radio contact throughout the extraction flight, providing updates on enemy activity in the area they had just departed. Taliban forces were already moving to occupy the abandoned SEAL positions and recover any equipment left behind during the hasty withdrawal. The timing of the rescue had been absolutely critical, with perhaps 30 minutes separating success from complete disaster. As the helicopter approached the forward operating base where medical personnel were waiting, Jake Morrison finally allowed himself to believe that his team would survive their ordeal. However, he also understood that serious questions would need to be answered about how 8 highly trained SEALs had been abandoned by their own command structure and left to die in the Afghan mountains. The unauthorized rescue operation had involved significant risks for everyone involved, from the air crews who had flown without official approval to the ground controllers who had organized the mission using intercepted communications. Someone had made the decision that the lives of 8 American servicemen were worth more than military regulations and chain-of-command protocols. Marcus Chen had maintained detailed records of all radio transmissions during their ordeal, including the official communications indicating that no rescue was being planned for their team. This documentation would become crucial evidence in the investigation that would inevitably follow their return to friendly lines. As the helicopter touched down at the medical facility, Jake realized that their survival was only the beginning of a larger story. Someone within the military hierarchy had deliberately sacrificed his team, while others had risked their careers and possibly their freedom to bring them home alive. The battle in the mountains was over, but the fight for truth and accountability was just beginning. 6 months after their rescue from the Afghan mountains, Jake Morrison sat in a sterile conference room at the Pentagon, facing a panel of senior military officers and government officials who seemed more interested in covering up the truth than uncovering it. The investigation into their abandoned mission had become a bureaucratic maze designed to protect high-ranking officials while deflecting blame onto lower-level personnel. The official report concluded that the SEAL team's mission had been compromised by intelligence failures and communication breakdowns, carefully avoiding any mention of the deliberate decision to abandon them when they came under attack. The unauthorized rescue operation was described as a fortunate coincidence, rather than the coordinated effort that had actually saved their lives. Tommy Walsh had survived his wounds but required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation before returning to limited duty status. The shrapnel damage to his abdomen had ended his career as a frontline operator, forcing him into training and administrative roles that he accepted with characteristic good humor, despite his disappointment. Sam Mitchell had recovered completely from his shoulder wound and fever, but the psychological impact of the mission had proven more difficult to overcome. The young SEAL struggled with survivor's guilt and questions about military loyalty that his training had never prepared him to address. He eventually requested transfer to a different unit, hoping that a fresh start would help him process his experiences. Alex Thompson had been awarded a Silver Star for his actions during the extended firefight, particularly his success in eliminating the enemy sniper and providing target designation for the airstrikes that enabled their rescue. However, he privately questioned whether medals could compensate for the betrayal they had experienced from their own command structure. The identity of Guardian Angel remained officially classified, but Jake had learned through unofficial channels that the rescue operation had been organized by a group of pilots and controllers who had monitored the emergency transmissions and decided to act without authorization. Several careers had been quietly ended through administrative actions, while others received transfers to remote assignments. Marcus Chen's communications records had been confiscated as classified evidence, preventing any independent verification of the official investigation's conclusions. His detailed logs of radio transmissions, including the message indicating that no rescue was planned, had disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery that prioritized institutional protection over individual accountability. The Taliban commander, known as the Wolf, had escaped during the chaos following their firefight, eventually surfacing in intelligence reports from Pakistan several weeks later. The original mission objective had been completely abandoned, with no subsequent attempts to eliminate the target, despite the sacrifices made by the SEAL team during their operation. Jake found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about military service and the bonds between soldiers and their leadership. The men who had volunteered for dangerous missions with the understanding that everything possible would be done to bring them home safely had learned that such promises were conditional on political and bureaucratic considerations. Danny Rodriguez had requested early retirement from active duty, choosing to pursue civilian medical training rather than continue serving in an organization that had proven willing to sacrifice experienced personnel for unknown reasons. His expertise and dedication had saved multiple lives during the mission, but the betrayal he had witnessed made continued service impossible for him to accept. Kevin Park and Brian Foster had returned to operational duties with different SEAL teams, but both men carried psychological scars from their abandoned mission that affected their trust in military leadership. They performed their duties with professional competence, but the enthusiasm and dedication that had previously characterized their service had been permanently damaged. The broader implications of their experience extended beyond the immediate participants to affect trust and morale. Throughout the special operations community, word of the abandoned mission had spread despite official secrecy requirements, creating doubt about whether similar betrayals might occur in future operations involving political sensitivity or bureaucratic inconvenience. Jake's attempts to pursue accountability through official channels had been consistently frustrated by classification restrictions and bureaucratic delays that seemed designed to exhaust his patience and resources. Military justice procedures that theoretically protected servicemen from arbitrary treatment proved ineffective when senior officials chose to invoke national security considerations. The families of the SEAL team members had been told that the mission details were classified, but that their loved ones had performed with exceptional courage under difficult circumstances. The sanitized version of events provided no indication of the abandonment and unauthorized rescue that had actually determined whether their husbands and fathers returned home alive or in coffins. During quiet moments, Jake found himself thinking about the unnamed pilots and controllers who had risked their careers to save 8 strangers they had never met. Their actions had demonstrated the military values of loyalty and sacrifice that he had believed characterized the entire organization, even as official policies proved those values were not universally shared by military leadership. The fire from the ridge that had lit their way home during that desperate night in Afghanistan had come not from the institutional military they served, but from individual warriors who chose to honor bonds of brotherhood that transcended regulations and chain-of-command protocols. The rescue had been accomplished by people who understood that some obligations cannot be abandoned regardless of official convenience or political calculation. Jake Morrison eventually returned to operational duties, but with a changed perspective on military service and personal loyalty. He continued to lead men in dangerous missions, but with the knowledge that ultimate responsibility for their survival might rest entirely on the shoulders of the team members themselves, rather than the larger organization they served. The mountains of Afghanistan had taught him that survival sometimes depends not on official support systems or institutional promises, but on the character and dedication of individual people who choose to do what is right regardless of personal cost. The SEALs had been left for dead by their own command, but they had been brought home alive by warriors who understood that some bonds cannot be broken by bureaucracy or betrayal. In the end, the fire from the ridge had illuminated more than just their escape route through the Afghan mountains. It had revealed fundamental truths about courage, loyalty, and sacrifice that would guide Jake Morrison's decisions for the rest of his military career and beyond. Some lights shine brightest in the darkest moments, providing hope and direction when all official sources of support have failed.